How's everybody doing today? This is my lecture series on Middle East politics. Our next lecture, today's lecture is going to be about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and how the European powers, specifically the French and the British, divided up the former Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire into new states, such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. So we're going to talk about how this process went down and the challenges it brought really for these new states that were created in the Middle East. So first, let me just share my screen with everybody. And so in order to understand the importance of Sykes-Picot and the challenges, the problems it created for the region, we have to first understand what exactly is state building. So what does it mean to create a state? Because that's essentially what the Europeans did here after Sykes-Picot, after World War I. And we're going to understand the process by which they did this, right? So we're going to look at their motivations, how they created these new states, and in what ways they did and didn't involve the indigenous peoples of the region. So as you're going to find out, this agreement has created great problems. To this day, there are intellectuals, political actors, terrorist organizations who continue to denounce this agreement and claim that it was imposed upon the Middle East. So very controversial, okay? And there were three specific agreements that led to the emergence of these states. Now, most people just associate it with Sikes-Picot, but it was actually a series of other agreements. The three big ones were Hussein-McMahon, Sikes-Picot, and San Remo, but there were also others. Okay, so we're going to talk about these agreements and how it shaped the borders of these regions and the futures of these countries in the aftermath. All right, so what exactly is state building? Okay, well, first we got to define what a state is. Now, for the Americans listening to this, we can't get confused by how Americans tend to use this term and how political scientists use it. So for Americans, a state is a province, right? America has 50 states. But for political scientists, when we speak of states, you have to think more about how we think of governments, right? It's an organization that has control or relative monopoly on violence over a territory. Right. So the American government is a state, right? Great Britain's a state. France has a state. Germany has a state. So, and modern states are very powerful, right? For one, they have clearly measured territory with fixed borders. Now, ancient empires didn't have this. Their borders shifted constantly across time. They often didn't have these treaties and agreements with their neighbors agreeing on fixed borders. So borders were often very fluid, they shifted, but with the modern state, the borders are fixed. And at times as well, sometimes in the case of colonies, those borders were fixed by outsiders. So they have fixed borders. Number two, in order to be able to really have near total control over your territory, you need a modern bureaucracy and military. So the bureaucracy has to be well staffed and trained. It needs access to modern technology and resources and infrastructure, right? So you need roads and bridges, railways, airports, telecommunications, that sort of thing. And security forces need to be well armed. And so this is what makes a modern state differ from a pre-modern one, where the state didn't have a legitimacy on violence. Think of like a weak feudal kingdom, for example. Now, on top of this as well, the modern state, for it to be stable, has to have what's called sovereignty. Sovereignty means you have the right to rule over that particular territory. And you're recognized as being the rightful rulers by those living within the country and those living outside of it. Now, what does this mean? It means your neighbors, other foreign countries, recognize your right to exist. And if they don't, that could create a lot of problems with your stability. So you need external sovereignty, but you also need internal sovereignty. The people the state rules over need to be accepted by at least part of the population, right? You need people to pay taxes. to join the military, to not revolt, right? So this is critical. You need internal sovereignty as well. And part of how modern states do this, how they create internal sovereignty, is they promote a common national identity, right? You use the educational system and the mass media to promote this idea that we're all Americans or Egyptians or Germans or Saudi Arabians. So you promote a sense of nationalism, pride in national identity. This binds people together in support of the state. Now, of course, this is the ideal definition here. Many states vary in terms of how much they have a monopoly of violence over their territory, how much support they have within their populations. And as you're going to find out, the states that were created out of Sikes-Picot and San Remo in the Middle East, specifically Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, they are going to suffer from extreme problems with legitimacy and with internal instability. So states have to be built, right? And so we call this process of creating a state building. The United States didn't emerge out of nowhere, nor did Germany or France or Great Britain. These states were constructed by human beings through collective action, through building institutions, through creating public educational institutions to foster national identity, by creating militaries and engaging in warfare. States are constructed. And there's a variety of ways they can be constructed. Some states are constructed by indigenous forces, meaning people come together to defend their territory, increase the strength of their military to defend their borders, whereas others are imposed by outsiders, by colonial powers who sweep in, conquer a place, and then create a new state artificially. And this is how some of the states in the Middle East were created. Now, I do have to let you all know that this is not how all states were created. Some countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they were formed from indigenous forces. But others, such as Iraq, were created artificially from the outside, right? And the countries we're going to discuss today were part of the former Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I. This was all that was left of the Arab world that was controlled by the Turks from Istanbul. So these countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, were created on a map by the Europeans after World War I. And this also happens to be, for the most part, the least stable part of the Middle East today. There's a couple of other areas such as Yemen and Libya we're going to talk about later in the semester. But these states have had extreme amounts of instability in comparison with others such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia. All right, so why were these states created and why were they carved out of the Ottoman Empire? Well, the story starts with World War I, this catastrophic conflict that took place between 1914 and 1918. This war involved two major sides. Okay, so on one side, we've got the Entente, the Allied powers, right? The UK, France, and Russia. Okay, now, as you learned early in the semester, the UK and the French used to be competitors. And of course, they also competed with the Russians. But this is going to change in the late 19th and early 20th century due to the rise of a new power within Europe, the Germans. In 1871, the German state unified under the Prussian leader Otto von Bismarck, and it's going to quickly become an industrial powerhouse. It's going to start its own hunt for colonies. It's going to engage in militarization, and it's also going to start to make strategic alliances with its neighbors, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and as we talked last class, with the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans, as you learned in previous lectures, had been losing territory to the French and British. They, for example, lost Algeria to the French in 1830. They lost control of Egypt, eventually to British colonization. And so thus, by the late 19th century, they were looking for new allies to stop European expansion. And with the emergence of Germany, it becomes an alliance of convenience. And thus, the Ottoman Empire throws their hat in with the Germans. Now, what was the motive for this war? Well, the motives for this conflict deal with a lot of things we've talked about in previous lectures on the modern world, right? So part of it has to do with nationalist competition over imperialism in trying to gain access to new colonies. These European powers were going all throughout the world trying to gain access to new territories and resources, to expand their empires, to increase their political strength at the expense of their enemies. This was also a way as well to help with industrialization. These countries were industrializing quickly, and this meant they needed new types of raw materials. They needed iron ore. They needed access to oil. They needed access to all other types of minerals, right? And in the process of this competition, they begin to build up their militaries. And with these new industries emerging, they begin to mass produce weapons. And by the 1890s, weapons of mass destruction, such as the Gatling gun, automatic weapons, began to emerge. These are weapons when you hold down the trigger, it spits out hundreds of bullets within a very short period of time. And so these big issues intensified conflict across Europe. And in the process, it also led to the emergence of nationalist pride and competition. And the spark that led to the war was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. He was an Austro-Hungarian noble. He was killed by a Serbian separatist. So this was in the Balkans. And this ignited a 4-year war where this alliance system kicked in, where these sides fought against one another. The conflict killed over 40 million people because of the use of modern weapons and the use of trench warfare. So very destructive conflict overall. Now, the Ottoman Empire did not fall down without swinging. They went out swinging here. They really did. For 4 years, they put up stiff resistance against the British and the French, as well as their colonies. So it was a long, drawn-out, bitter conflict. And so let me just kind of show you what this looked like on a map here. So we have France, Great Britain, and Russia on one side of this conflict. And then we've got these central powers, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans. And you can see here why they're called the central powers. And this was actually a big disadvantage for the central powers because they were fighting really a two-front war against the Allied powers within this conflict. Now, as I said, the Ottomans did not go out swinging. The British, in order to try to take out the Ottoman Empire early in the war, their first strategy was to try to land a large contingent of troops onto this peninsula that controls the Dardanelles Straits that lead to the Ottoman Empire's capital, Istanbul. So they were hoping that if they could take out this strait and then from there take the capital, they could knock the Ottomans out of the war. One little problem, the Ottomans were well armed because the Germans had helped them really advance their military capacity. They were able to build trenches around the capital Istanbul and along the strait, and they were armed with automatic weapons. So when the British troops landed, they were met with machine gun fire, and really over 130,000 people got killed. So this was a really brutal. So one battle alone, just think about how bloody this war was, 130,000 people killed. And by the way, it wasn't just the British fighting here. It was their colonies. It was the Australians, the Egyptians, people from all throughout their colonies who were fighting here, from India. So lots of people get killed. It was bloody. And eventually the British realized they were going to have to change their tactics here to try to take out the Ottoman Empire. And so what the British decide to do instead, in the aftermath of this, is they start to look for potential allies within the Ottoman Empire who they can try to convince to revolt against the Turks. And so this is going to lead to something called the Hussein-McMahon Agreement. So the British sought to promote rebellion against the Ottomans from people that were aggrieved with the empire. Now, there were a lot of different groups that were growing more angry with the Ottoman Empire during this time period. There were a lot of separatist groups that were emerging during the era of the last Ottoman Caliph, Abdulhamid II, and then under the Young Turks. We talked about this last lecture. The Ottomans were growing increasingly repressive against religious minorities and linguistic minorities. And in the process of this, it was leading to a lot of animosity. So from 1908 to 1918, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by this coalition called the Young Turks. And it was a single-party dictatorship led by the Committee of Union and Progress. They were trying to promote the Turkish language at the expense of all other languages. This created a lot of hatred amongst a lot of the Arab population. And thus the British sought to use this animosity against the Turks to convince them to revolt. And so what do the British do? Well, they decide they are going to look for the support of Arab elites from the Ottoman province of the Hejaz region. This contains the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And so they turned to the Arab elites within Mecca that were led by a group of Hashemites, that is, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And their leader at the time was named Sharif Hussein. He was the overseer of the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, you might be asking, why did the British turn to this particular local elite? Well, it's because Mecca is the heart and center of the Islamic world, right? It's the center of pilgrimage. It's the place of birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And the British were hoping if they could turn Arab elites in that region against the Ottoman Empire, it could galvanize larger Islamic support for a rebellion against the Ottomans. So what did the British do? They convinced the Sharif Hussein of Mecca to revolt. He was hesitant at first. His family for centuries had been under the Ottoman rule. And of course, the British were fighting a Muslim empire here. But the British were successful at convincing the Sharif Hussein of Mecca because of a lot of the animosity that Arabs were having towards the Turks at this time period. And so he was a local Arab and Hashemite political leader. He was a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He had a lot of legitimacy. And when he decided to revolt, a lot of Arabs in the region joined him. And him and his two sons, Abdullah and Faisal, are going to raise troops and fight in a conflict against the Ottoman Empire. Now, this agreement, it's known as the Hussein-McMahon Agreement. The name of the British diplomat, McMahon, he negotiated this with the Sharif Hussein in a series of letters. There was a correspondence that took place. And essentially what happens is the British, they turn to Hussein and they say, look, if you help us, you do this for us, we are going to promise you your own state after the war. The former Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire will be under the control of yourself and your sons. You will have your own Arab states. Sound like a good deal here, huh? And so, of course, in return, Hussein agrees to rally Arabs to revolt. And in order to help out the Sharif Hussein, the British arm him, right? They arm him and his supporters with modern military weapons, and they help him with modern tactics. They sent an officer named T.E. Lawrence. If you've ever watched Lawrence of Arabia, very good film, I recommend doing so. It talks about this. So he gets sent to the Hejaz region, and he begins to mobilize these Arab troops with the Sharif Hussein, and they engage in this rebellion. And they helped the British and French. It was a long, grinding war. It took 4 years. These Arab troops engaged in hit-and-run tactics against Ottoman forces. They sabotaged the railway networks of the Ottomans. And eventually, by 1918, they had helped the British and French conquer the Arab lands of the Ottoman empires. And so the Ottomans were forced back, what was left of their troops into what is now Anatolia and what is modern Turkey. So they had lost all of their Arab lands by 1918. And these Arab troops at the end of the war were in the city of Damascus and what is now Syria, stationed there. So Sharif Hussein was made a lot of promises, and he delivered, right? So he mobilizes these troops. He helps the British and French. Now, here's where the controversy comes in with all of this, the betrayal with all of this. So technically speaking, you see where these Arab lands are, where it says Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine here. These are the lands that were supposed to go to the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, when this war ended. So you can see here, this is what the Ottoman Empire lost. All that was left for the Ottomans after the war was this area that we now call Turkey. We're going to talk about this state in the next class. So they were promised these lands. But the British never delivered. And there is a reason for this, because while they had made this agreement with Sharif Hussein, they were secretly negotiating behind his back with the French. You see, the British were worried about getting into a war with the French after this war ended over the Middle East. They didn't want to fight over this territory. And so the British secretly negotiated with the French. Now, the French also had their own interests in these former Arab lands. We talked a couple of classes ago about how the French had special interest in Mount Lebanon and that that now autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire. In 1860, the French invaded Lebanon in order to protect the Christian minorities there, and they forced the Ottoman empires to give the Lebanese autonomy. So the French did not want to see Beirut, that Lebanon, come under the control of Sharif Hussein and the Arabs. And the French as well had a lot of trade and contacts in this region, a lot of missionaries working there. So they didn't want to give this territory up, and they didn't make this agreement with the Sharif Hussein. And so the British, on top of that, they had a lot of interest in oil in the region. Oil was beginning to be discovered. They were very much interested in places like Iran, Iraq, the Arab Gulf. So they are going to have growing interest in this region as well. And so they're not going to want to give up all these lands to the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. So in 1916, two French and British diplomats, Mark Sykes and Francois-Picot, right, they come together in 1916 and they decide to take out a map and draw some lines and divide up this territory amongst themselves. And this was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So basically, the French and British here, they draw up their own post-war plans to divide up the region amongst themselves, right? So on a map, they draw a bunch of artificial borders, and they say, this is what we're going to take over after the war. And basically, the agreement was that the French would take most of the northern part of this territory, whereas the British would take the south. So basically, they decide to carve up the Ottoman lands amongst themselves like they were at a party dividing up a pie of pizza here. So this was really seen as a great betrayal after the war by the Arabs as a consequence, right? It went against what the British had promised to Sharif Hussein. Now, I do have to warn you here, though. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was not the final agreement. For one, there's a lot, as you're going to see on the maps I'm going to show you, the borders are going to shift and change by the time we get to the San Remo Agreement in 1920, because of a lot of factors that changed on the ground after the war. So this is an important point to make. Now, with that said, I do want to talk about what this agreement entailed. So the basic idea was, if you see in these purple colors here, this was the territory that was to be under French rule here. Whereas this territory that is in pink here was to be under British rule. Okay, so they were going to basically split it in half. Now, a couple of other things. You see where it says Palestine here? Palestine was carved out. Now, the initial intention of this agreement was that Palestine wouldn't be given to any one European power, but it would be under joint British, French, and Russian protection. At this point during World War I, the Russians were still fighting the war, and they were still ruled by the Tsars, a very conservative religious monarchy that was interested in protecting Orthodox Christians in Palestine. So the British, French, and Russians had this separate agreement, okay, this agreement of Constantinople, where they agreed Palestine would be under international rule. And in fact, it was also part of that agreement, the Russians were going to take over Istanbul, right? And there was also this agreement as well that the Armenian Orthodox Christians in what is now Northeast Anatolia and Northeast Turkey would have their own states. And notice here how these boundaries don't reflect the modern states. These boundaries are going to shift by the San Remo Agreement. Furthermore, because Russia dropped out of the war, they're not going to have a say in this final agreement. In 1917, Russia had a communist revolution. The Soviet Union is going to be created. They're going to drop out of the war. And because of this, they're not going to have a say in this final agreement. And on top of that, the Soviet Union, being a very far left-wing government, couldn't care less about Christians in Palestine. So they're going to drop out. On top of this as well, the Ottomans are going to commit some massacres against the Armenians. There's going to be a genocide that takes place. And so thus, a lot of these plans are going to go kaput. And on top of that, what is left of the Ottoman Empire after the war, they're going to kick foreign forces out of Anatolia here. So a lot of these borders are not going to stay the same. Instead, it is the San Remo agreement that is going to be the final agreement. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is Sykes-Picot considered so important? Well, it's important because it's seen as a great betrayal, right? For the Arabs, it was kind of seen like a knife being put in their backs as they were helping the British defeat the Ottoman Empire. So the San Remo agreement, this is the agreement that's going to shape the final borders for the most part of the region. This is a war, okay, this is an agreement that followed World War I. So it ended in 1918. And of course, the Allies won, the British, the French, and eventually America also joined in the conflict in 1917 following the German bombing, the German destruction of American merchant ships, right? So the Americans joined the war. This is eventually going to help the Allies win, and the Ottoman Empire was defeated. And in the aftermath of the war, a convention was held. It was at Versailles in France. And eventually what was signed was known as the Versailles Treaty. This was a negotiation that took place between 1919 and 1920 between the combatants of World War I over the post-war settlement. And of course, the talks were dominated by the winners, the British, the French, and the Americans. Now, the British and French, they had wanted to divide up the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves and create new colonies. The Americans, though, were not in favor of this. Woodrow Wilson, he was in favor of his 14 points. He wanted to bring about an end to colonization to avoid another war. He wanted to promote free trade across the globe, and he wanted to ease tensions and avoid another conflict by creating a new international institution called the League of Nations. And so thus there was a debate about what to do with these former Arab lands. Now, here's the thing, though. The Arabs were not invited to the party. They were not invited to negotiations. Sharif Hussein was not invited. No Egyptian elites. A lot of Egyptians had helped the British fight the war. They were a colony of the British at the time. They were not invited to the party at all. So they were not invited in negotiations. Once again, this was seen as a great betrayal and a sign of things to come here. And so out of these discussions between the Americans, the British, and French, what emerged was the San Remo Conference of 1920 in a final agreement on the former Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire. So what this agreement did is, one, it set much of the boundaries of the Middle East without Arab input. It created Iraq, Palestine, Syria. It created Jordan. It created Lebanon on a map. Okay, and so new countries created out of whole cloth. And so these new states had not existed before, right? And so I'm going to talk in a second about the motivations for the formation of these 5 states, but they were created on a map. They were artificial. And of course, these states contained a tremendous amount of ethnic diversity. Now, of course, having ethnic diversity in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but as you're going to find out, the way the British and French ruled these new colonies was incredibly problematic. So, in one respects, this was kind of treated as a post-war really spoils effort here, right? In other words, the British and French are going to use this war as an excuse to really gain more colonies. However, and this is an important however, they had to make some compromises with the Americans and with the newly created League of Nations. The Europeans promised that these new colonies would not be permanent, okay? They were supposed to, the Europeans, prepare these countries for independence. So they were mandated to prepare these countries for independence. They would not be permanent. Okay, they were going to create new governments and then eventually leave. Okay, now, of course, the British and French, what they were hoping to do was set up governments that would abide by their interests, right? So by the time they would leave. So that was the idea, what the British and French had in mind. We know this is the mandate system. So these new countries, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan, were known as mandates. Okay, so they weren't really official colonies. Now, the United Kingdom, they would take the newly created countries of Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. And I will explain in a second why these three countries were created. And number two, France would take Syria and Lebanon. So these five countries were carved out of this agreement. And so this is what, for the most part, what the final map looked like. Now, just to tell you about why this agreement turned into the way it did. Okay, so part of the reason, so you notice here it's slightly different from Sykes-Picot. This northern part of what is now Iraq here was initially going to go to the French, but the British had secretly discovered oil deposits in northern Iraq, and the French weren't aware of this. And so the British lobbied very hard to get this northern province, and what they argued was that, see these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley here, they argued that this river valley should be kept intact, but the British were secretly interested in this oil province. And so Iraq was carved out of this. Now, the French got the rest of what they wanted to get. And what the French were really interested in here was Lebanon. That was their big interest. They had a lot of stake here. And in fact, they wanted the Christians of Mount Lebanon to have their own country, or at least be a majority in their own country. So they created this new country that had a slight Christian majority within it, at least at the time of independence. And they carved it out of the rest of what was the former Ottoman province of Syria. Okay? Now, on top of this as well, the British, all right, they're going to take over Palestine. Now, during the war, they had actually promised Jewish Zionist organizations that if they supported the British war effort, that Jews can migrate to Palestine when the war ended. And so thus, this is what happened. We're going to talk more about this. This is a whole separate issue. We're going to talk about this more in a separate lecture. But just know Palestine was created out of this. Now, finally, Transjordan was created here for a reason I'm going to get to in a second, okay? But there's a very separate reason why this was created. And I'm also going to talk more about Iraq and Syria here. And so basically, this region was carved out artificially. And I'm going to explain now why this was a problem. I'm going to hone in on three case studies here: Iraq, Syria, and Transjordan, just to explain why this is a big problem. We're going to talk more about Palestine and Lebanon in a separate lecture. Now, the first of these countries that was created, Iraq, okay? The term Iraq itself, it was a geographic term that means the shore of the river, okay? There was never a province or a country called Iraq before this. And it's referring here to the shores, quote unquote, of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys here, okay? These two rivers that run through the heart of Iraq. Of course, these rivers are incredibly important to this country's history. The Tigris-Euphrates River Valley was the first place where human civilization emerged. It's where agriculture was where it first emerged. It's where the world's first towns and cities were created, the world's oldest civilizations. We're talking about 10,000 years of civilization here. And of course, it was not only the center of, ancient Sumeria civilization, but many empires that would follow, including being the center of the Abbasid Caliphate, which we talked about in a previous lecture. This was the center of the Golden Age of Islam. And of course, Baghdad was the center of all that. Baghdad would become the new capital of this new country. Now, here's the thing with Iraq, though. Following the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, this region would undergo a severe agricultural decline due to climate changes and would become really a backwater region later of the Ottoman Empire. And under the Ottomans, it was ruled as three separate provinces, not as a single province. And there was a reason for this. The northern parts, okay, was ruled from the city of Mosul here. And the reason why is because this is a mountainous region of Iraq, the far north here. And there are a group of mountainous peoples who speak a separate language called Kurdish. It's an Indo-European language very distantly related from Persian, Farsi, which is the language of Iran. And so it's found in the far north here. It consists of mainly Sunni Kurds here. The center of the country, the second province, was ruled from Baghdad, okay? And it consisted mainly of Sunni Arabs. This was the wealthiest part of Iraq, the most urbanized. It's the one as well under the Ottomans that was most influenced by the Tanzimat reforms, by defensive developmentalism. It had the largest rates of literacy. It had universities. It was more well developed. So it was the wealthiest of these three. And then finally, the far south consists of Shia Arabs in Basra. This is a region that for part of a time period was actually ruled by the Safavid Empire based in Iran. It's part of the reason why it's 12 or Shia today, because the peoples here were converted to Shiism during this empire. So it was very heavily influenced as well. Its Arabic is influenced by a lot of Farsi words, so it's got a lot of ties to Iran. On top of that, this is a place that has two major sites of Shia pilgrimage, Karbala and El-Najaf. And so these are places where two very important members of the Prophet's family, Ali and Hussein, were martyred by the Sunni caliphs, right? So this is an important place for Shia Arabs. So Basra was the third province. So these are the reasons why it was ruled as three separate provinces. So it has differences in geography, culture, and just in terms of the political dynamics, right, and the socioeconomic dynamics. So it was ruled as three separate provinces. Now, why did it become one country? Well, the British justified it on the basis of this river, but as I said, they had a couple of major interests. Number one, there was oil discoveries here in northern Iraq. And on top of that, there were recent oil discoveries here in the Gulf in neighboring Iran, where the British also had a lot of influence. So as a consequence of this, they wanted this country united. They wanted the ability to ship those oil resources to the Persian Gulf here and keep this as a single country. But of course, what they ended up creating here was this immensely diverse country. So it was given to the British as a mandate after World War I. Now, diversity in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. If you have a democracy that treats ethnic groups equally, that allows for multiculturalism, that allows local communities to teach their children in their own language, you could avoid a lot of problems with ethnic conflict. But if you have a situation where you prop up one of those ethnic groups into power at the expense of others and engage in divide and conquer, well, then you've got a major problem on your hands. Now, the British, they're going to rule this colony indirectly. They're going to prop up a government there. Now, here's the thing. Because they had kind of betrayed the Sharif Hussein's family, they did want to partially make it up to them. So they went to Sharif Hussein's son, Faisal, who had helped them out tremendously in the war. And they said, look, we know we promised you the whole Arab region here, but instead, we're going to make you king of this new country of Iraq. You're going to be the new monarch of this country. Now, the Sharif Hussein and his son Faisal, they were Sunni Muslims, and this monarchy would have its capital in Baghdad. So naturally, they're going to support the Sunni Arabs. They're going to have to create a new bureaucracy and military overnight for this new country. And since Sunni Arabs were based in Baghdad, it's also where you had the most educated population, they were going to recruit heavily from the Sunni Arab population. And in the educational system, they are going to promote the Arabic language. Naturally, this is going to lead to mass discrimination against Shia and Kurds, as well as tremendous frustration with this new government. It's going to lead to a lot of conflict and instability that is going to last until the present day. In fact, this monarchy is not going to last long. Okay, it's going to eventually be overthrown in the late 1950s. So really, the British were setting up an incredibly unstable situation here in Iraq. And the British, for their part, were not interested in industrialization or investing in serious economic development in this country. They were interested in pulling oil resources out of the country and exporting it. And thus, you have this monarchy that becomes oil dependent and dependent on the British for their foreign security, right? So they become tied to the British. This seriously hurts their legitimacy, both within the country and amongst their neighbors as well. And so thus, what gets created here is a very weak and unpopular state. And, here, another problem with Sykes-Picot is that it divided up a lot of ethnic groups across borders. So this is where we find Kurdish speakers in the world today. They're not only found in northern Iraq, they're found in northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, and in northwestern Iran. And to this day, the Kurds are minorities in these countries. They face severe discrimination, and this has led to separatist movements and lots of problems with political violence. We're going to learn more about this later in the semester. So that's Iraq. Case one, just a big problem. Iraq is really going to turn into a disaster in the following decades. Problem number two, the creation of Jordan. Now, Jordan is perhaps the most artificial of the states that were created here for a variety of reasons, okay? For one, this is a country that had a very small population. It's now 11 million, and at the time there were, approximately only 1 million people living within this very small country. And on top of having a small population, it was mainly a desert country. Jordan is a country without much in the way of resources, whether agricultural or mineral. And on top of it as well, it only had a few villages that were concentrated around this river here, the Jordan River, where it gets its name. You can see it on the map. This is the Jordan River. The sea here is called the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea itself, not good for agriculture. It is highly salinized. It's got a lot of salt. In fact, I've been to the Dead Sea before. When you go into the Dead Sea and you swim in it, you actually can't sink. In fact, it's so salty that when the water gets in your eyes, it burns. I was only in the water for about 10 minutes. It's a cool experience until you get water in your eyes, and it's not good for agriculture, is what I'm trying to say. And so, thus, you don't have a lot of really good agricultural lands here. You had small populations, and it wasn't urbanized, and it was not influenced very much by the Tanzimat and the defensive development reforms of the Ottoman Empire. It's really in the major urban centers of the empire that were influenced. So this was mainly a desert region. It wasn't ruled as a province by the Ottoman Empire. Jordan had never existed, right? So Transjordan was a completely artificial country. Now, the one advantage it did have, it was relatively homogenous. About 94% of citizens were Arab Muslims. But as you're going to find out, what's going to happen is a massive number of migrants are going to come to this country, causing severe problems with instability from neighboring states like Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. Now, just like Iraq, it was a British mandate. So why did the British create this country? Why not just make it part of Palestine or make it part of Iraq? Why create this? Well, there's a very simple reason for this. It has to do with King Hussein's other son, Abdullah. You see, when Faisal was in Damascus in 1918, he found out about the betrayal by the French and the British. And what happened is the French then invaded Syria and kicked King Hussein, kicked Faisal out of this new French territory. Abdullah, his brother, was still in Mecca, defending Mecca and Medina, right? So this was the heartland of Sharif Hussein's, territory. So once that happened, and he found out about the betrayal, he raised a new army and he marched north to confront the British and the French. And so the British realized we've got to find a way to deal with this. And so as he was marching north towards Syria, he was in this region that we now know as Jordan. And so the British said, look, stop the march. We will create a whole new country for you. This country will be called Jordan. So this was really done on the spot. They create this country that had no natural resources, and to this day remains dependent on foreign aid. First the British, later the Americans. In fact, we give about $500 million in aid to this very small country to help keep it afloat. So small country, small population, heavily dependent on foreign aid. And this country, it's the only, by the way, it's the only one of these governments that were set up by the mandate system that is going to survive to the present. All the other monarchies and governments set up in the region, they're going to eventually collapse. They're going to fall. Jordan is going to survive. The monarchy is going to survive, but this is only due to the fact that it had a tiny population, the fact that it wasn't geostrategically strategic. Very few people care about it. And on top of that as well, because it took in a lot of refugees from these neighboring countries, it receives a lot of aid from the United Nations. So about 30% of the population now consists of refugees from Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. These neighboring failed states have, a lot of refugees have flooded into Jordan seeking safety and refuge. And so, for example, the Palestinians that live there, they're being supported by UN aid programs. So this country really is just on the constant verge of collapse, right? So there is a very dangerous situation within Jordan today, even though its monarchy has survived. Without that foreign aid, this country would be in trouble. All right, so our last country here, and I see something went wrong with my PowerPoint slide here. This sometimes happens. Don't worry, there's an easy fix. All right. Syria, our third case study we're going to go over here. So Syria, unlike Iraq and Jordan, was a French mandate. And, it is, if you notice here in the Northeast here, part of the Euphrates River Valley does flow into Syria. So it's part of the Fertile Crescent. We're talking 10,000 years of civilization here. And the western part here, of course, it sits on the Mediterranean. You get a lot of agriculture along this river and along the coast here because you get a Mediterranean climate. And, the southern part here as well was part of the Holy Land. So Syria just has thousands of years of civilization. It was part of the Fertile Crescent. And this is an incredibly ethnically diverse place here. While the majority are Sunni Arabs, there are also Sunni Kurds, so Sunni Muslim Kurds found in the Northeast here. We have many different types of Shia Arabs, the largest of which are a group known as the Alawi. They're about 10% of the population. They're actually going to dominate the country's politics until very recently. The Assad regime, for example, they were Alawi. And you also have this other religious group. They're monotheists called the Druze. They're an offshoot of Shiism. So, of course, go back to my lecture on Shiism versus Sunnism if you want to understand who these groups are. So the French, they create this very ethnically diverse country. Now, under the Ottoman Empire, what is now known as Syria was actually part of this larger province called Greater Syria. And it consisted not only of this territory, but Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, right? So, and that territory overall, despite having some ethnic diversity, was very heavily Sunni Arab, right? So you have this very large Greater Syrian province. Now, places like Palestine were sub-provinces within Greater Syria, but it was treated as a single province. And what does that mean? It means that you have a long history of trade, economic interconnection between Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. And a lot of people are not going to like the fact that all of these provinces got divided up because suddenly it's going to become harder to trade, especially for Sunni Arab merchants and their families. A lot of families and tribes got divided across these borders. So a lot of families were separated. It created a lot of animosity as a consequence of this. Now, the French, for their purposes, they engaged here in a lot of divide and conquer tactics as well. To rule over this diverse province, they were going to support some ethnic groups over others. So for one, Lebanon was created in order for the Christians to get their own majority nation. So Lebanon, it's going to be artificially created as a new country. And Syria, most Syrians to this day actually still have massive problems with it. Many do not recognize Lebanon as a separate country. And so for years, the Syrian government denied the existence of Lebanon. So there's going to be a lot of problems with legitimacy with these new borders. Now, on top of this as well, the French, they wanted to play divide and conquer. So they start to support the minority groups, particularly the Alawi and the Druze. So the Alawi, the Shia minority in particular, gets a lot of support. They get recruited into the colonial military. They get greater access to public resources, and they're given autonomy within this new mandate that's created. And on top of this as well, these religious minorities were given all sorts of other protections and favors within the regime at the expense of the Sunni Muslim Arabs. This is going to create a lot of animosity, and it's also going to lead to a situation where after independence, the Syrian state is eventually going to be dominated by the Alawi and by a small minority at the expense of the majority. It's going to lead to one of the world's worst totalitarian dictatorships under the Assad regime. So this created a lot of future problems, the way this regime emerged. Now, unlike Iraq or Jordan, these French did not prop up in their mandates a monarchy. Instead, they're going to eventually create a republic here. So they had never made a promise to the Sharif Hussein here. They're going to try to set up a French-style republic here. So naturally, this agreement did not go down well. Immediately, there was resistance, and to this day, there are many people who still reject the borders of Sikes-Picot and San Remo. Revolts broke out across the Arab world. Okay, so for example, in Egypt, Egypt was not part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it was a colony of the British, and they had helped the British during this war, many of the Egyptian elites, and they were angry that they were not invited to the Versailles Conference. And so a group of Egyptians led by the Wafd Party, and Wafd simply means delegation in Arabic. They were a group of middle-class liberals that wanted to send a delegation to Versailles but rejected. They revolt in 1919. So these middle-class social movements, both liberals and Islamists, they take to the streets and revolts. Iraq, for its parts, had a mass revolt. In the Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia regions, there were separate revolts against the creation of this new mandate for a variety of reasons. And in Syria, eventually there were a series of revolts, the worst of which was from 1925 to 1927, where hundreds were killed. There was also, as well, we're going to talk about later, a revolt in Palestine, lots of political conflict and violence at the end of the day. And so it was supported by both liberal and Islamist social movements here who came together to try to resist British and French rule and the creation of these new mandates. And so the first big revolution here was the 1919 revolution in Egypt. So the second major revolution in Egypt, the first one we talked about in an earlier class, the Arabi Revolt. So this is a liberal, middle class revolution, mainly led by their leader, Saad Zeghloul. He was a well-educated lawyer. He was somebody who he wanted democracy, he wanted a constitutional monarchy, and he wanted independence from the British. And so these revolts catalyzed a lot of conflict against the Europeans. And so how did the Europeans respond? Well, they responded first with coercion, right? They put these revolts down with violence. But there were two things, though, that are going to lead them as well to trying to satisfy the demands of these protesters. Number one, they were pressured by the Americans to set up a mandate system here, right? So they had to set up new governments and prepare them for independence. On top of this, number two, the British and French by this time period had these massive empires. They quite simply didn't have, the numbers of troops to constantly put down these revolts. So they try to co-opt some of the opposition, particularly the liberals within these countries. So Egypt was given its technical independence, and I put independence in quotes here, in 1922. They sit down and negotiate with the Wafd, and what they create is a new constitution in 1923, a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature. So this is basically how the British monarchy worked in the 17th century. Basically, there's a monarchy that's the head executive that enforces laws, but there was a bicameral legislature, two houses, that was elected by people who had land and who were literate. And these individuals would write laws, the king would enforce them, and there would be an independent judiciary. And so the monarchy had a lot of power within this system. They could suspend parliament and call snap elections whenever they wanted to. So constitutional monarchy was created in 1923. And this temporarily really eased protests. And the WAFD, for their part, actually participated in elections, and they became the most powerful party in parliaments during the interwar period between the world wars. So the WAFD party, they gained power in the legislature, while the monarchy, that's the dynasty of Muhammad Ali, would continue to control elections, and they would share power with the WAFD. And the constitutional monarchy, for their part, was able to continue their land holdings. And during this time period, there was substantial economic inequality between rich and poor in Egypt. The poor, for example, couldn't vote in these elections. And the British, for their part, would control foreign affairs and the Canal Zone. So the Egyptians could not control trade. They couldn't control so, for example, they couldn't put taxes on British imports to help the country industrialize. They couldn't protect their own internal sovereignty. They relied on the British for military support. And the British, for their part, would continue to occupy the Suez Canal. We talked about this in a previous lecture. This is an important canal that connected the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. So they make these compromises with the Egyptians, and they do the same thing in Iraq. So following those protests, eventually, after negotiations, a constitutional monarchy was created in 1925 with King Faisal continuing to be the monarch, but a legislature was created with elections involving wealthy elites. And eventually, independence, just like Egypt, independence in quotes, is going to be given in 1932 under the same conditions as Egypt. Okay, so they're going to have to allow free trade. They're going to have to allow British oil companies to pull oil out of the ground. And the British are going to be in charge of protecting the country's sovereignty from foreign enemies. This is going to severely hurt the legitimacy of not only these constitutional monarchies, but the liberal parties that are going to kind of be co-opted into this system. And eventually the French as well, although the French initially used a lot more coercion here, they're eventually going to give in as well. They're going to create a constitutional republic in 1930 with an elected parliament. And there is going to be elections that are held, and you're going to see liberals and Islamists partake in them. So eventually, we're going to see a constitutional republic emerge here. And France continued to dominate foreign policy and protect those religious minorities it had a stake in within this country. So very controversial response here. They're going to use a mix of coercion and cooptation. And so thus, the states that got built here, with their new constitutions and their structures, are going to severely lack legitimacy. Their borders were not seen as legitimate by many. The new governments that were created were not seen as legitimate. There was going to be a lot of violence and opposition that is going to emerge to these new states. Okay. Now, the French, by the way, were a little later to the game to officially giving Syria independence. It's not until World War II that the French, they're going to eventually give the Syrians independence in 1945. And so what gets created here, so my final slide here, are states without legitimacy. These colonial powers hurt the legitimacy of new states. And not only that, they even delegitimized liberalism as a consequence. There's going to be a lot of growing hatred towards capitalism and liberal democracy in the aftermath of this, because of this. And the monarchies as well in the region, their legitimacy is going to be hurt that were created in these new states. These new states, the fact is they were propped up with colonial military power, and many saw them as puppet states of Europeans. And the British and French, for their part, were not interested in investing in education. So, for example, under colonial rule in Egypt from 1882 up until 1952, The Egyptian literacy rate is not going to change. It started at 10% and it's going to stay at 10%. They're going to invest mainly in the exploitation of natural resources, oil in Iraq and cotton in Egypt, for example. And furthermore, their strategies of divide and conquer, right, supporting some ethnic minorities over others, is going to hurt national unity. It's going to pit groups against one another. It's going to create the conditions for a lot of violence. And these new governments, they're going to struggle to survive once Europe's power declines post-World War II. So as Europe declines, it's going to create tremendous problems with the survival of these new states. In fact, the only government that survives today is Jordan's monarchy. Okay, the other ones have been swept aside. Okay, so on a final note here, Sykes-Picot remains a massive controversy. For example, ISIS recently used that in their rhetoric to justify creating the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, right? So this state that traversed the borders of Iraq, parts of Iraq and Syria a couple of years ago. Sykes-Picot continues to remain a point of controversy, hurting the relationship between the quote-unquote West and Arab states to this very day. All right, so of course, though, we can't blame Sykes-Picot for all the problems in the region. For one, colonization started in Europe long before Sykes-Picot. We talked about Algeria and Egypt, right, and Libya with the Italians, Tunisia and Morocco. On top of this as well, not all states are going to be colonized. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia, for example, were never colonized. And different new problems are going to emerge after Sykes-Picot and different challenges. And so we don't want to, just point the blame at Sykes-Picot for all the problems in the region, but certainly it helps us understand some of the dynamics of the region today. All right, so that's it for the lecture. Next class, we're going to talk about indigenous state building in Turkey and Saudi Arabia to understand why those states are much stronger than our other case studies. And it'll help us have a nice kind of basis of comparison, right? So I'll see you next time.